Chapter 2, Whole to Three-Fifths Dehumanization. And Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Ethiopian woman who he had married, for he had married an Ethiopian woman, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against him. When I bring up the issue of slavery, all too often am I met with these words. Come on now, slavery was an accepted institution throughout the world for thousands of years. Every culture has had slaves. Americans were no different. And I cannot begin to tell you how many times white people have presented this argument to me. Perhaps this is just another effort to trivialize or justify America's crime. Perhaps it's just another way to try to resolve their internal conflicts. Whatever the motivation, the lengths people will go not to confront their history never ceases to amaze me. The truth is, American chattel slavery was different from most varieties of enslavement that preceded it. It differed in the manner in which a person became enslaved. It differed in the treatment of the enslaved. It differed in the length of the servitude. Most of all, it differed in the ways owners viewed those enslaved. Before the Ethiopian slave trade began in 1440, most people who became slaves became so as a result of war. Two societies went to war, and the winners enslaved the losers. Sometimes, as was the case with Rome, a dominant society would need more laborers. So they made war on a weaker state and took the manpower they required. Europeans, by contrast, systematically turned the capturing, shipping, and selling of other human beings into a business that would develop into the backbone of an entire economy. Providing the foundation for the world's wealthiest nation, the first enslaved Africans arrived in the Americas from Africa in the early 1500s. The transatlantic slave trade was made illegal in the United States in 1808 and continued in other parts of the Americas until 1870. Estimates of the number of people captured and transported during those 430 years vary. Reasonable estimates place the figure between 20 and 30 million. Slavery is a brutal institution in any society, yet it seems to that the treatment of enslaved by Europeans was practically so. In ancient Greece and Rome, throughout the African continent, though slaves were considered to be the property of their slave masters, they often had legal status. Many were able to ultimately gain freedom, citizenship. Slaves were granted freedom under a number of circumstances depending on the role in which they were served. Masters frequently liberated slaves who were considered faithful and loyal. Many slaves over time purchased their freedom. It was not uncommon for owners to free females for the purpose of marriage, in which, in case children from these marriages were usually free. During the time of American chattel slavery, it was exceedingly rare for a slave to be freed, and rarer still for an enslaved person to buy his or her freedom. Those slave owners fathered many children by slaves they enslaved. They never married the woman, and the overwhelmingly majority of the children they fathered remained enslaved throughout their lifetimes. Even if they wanted to marry, it was illegal to do so. While many societies educated their slaves, Southern colonies, later states, usually outlawed such practices, in which in most societies it was extremely rare for an enslaved population to reproduce itself, though through breeding, as did America's enslaved. Typically, children born to slaves in places other than the Americas were born free. In many societies, slavery was more akin to indentured servitude. There was a fixed amount of time enslaved persons were held in service to their owners, after which time they would be granted their freedom. In America, generations were born into slavery and died there. That black Africans sold other black Africans into slavery is a well known and often offered as a rationalization by apologists for the institution of slavery. This has led to significant misunderstandings regarding the role of Africans in the slave trade. When enemy tribes in Africa made war, the conqueror took prisoners and made them what we called indentured servants, not chattel. With the coming of the European slavers vanished, warriors could be sold in an effort to reduce the enemy tribe's warrior forces. Even so, Africans could not imagine the level of degradation and hardship experienced by slaves in America, since they did not behave that way toward their conquered. Consequently, when Africans sold their captives to white slave merchants, there was no way for them to know how they would be treated upon their arrival in America. Thus, we have no way to determine how Africans would have responded to had there been aware of the conditions to where they were condemning those that were sold. Of greater importance, it is that American slavery experience was based exclusively on the nation of racial inferiority, according to Thomas D. Morris in Southern Slavery and Law, 1619 through 1860. Africans were considered to be presumed or natural slaves based on their skin color. They were also referred to as thinking property, inherently, quote, rightless persons. In few societies, if any, was so large a group of people considered to be less than human based upon physical appearance, yet Europeans concluded that black Africans were fitted by natural act of God to the position of permanent bondage. Permanent bondage. It was the regulation to lesser humanity that allowed the institution of child slavery to be inter interracially linked with violence, and it was through violence, aggregation, and dehumanization that the institute of slavery was enacted, legislated, perpetrated by Europeans. The Three-Fifths Compromise. We subscribe to the doctorate. Might one of our Southern brethren observe the representation relates more immediately to persons and taxation more immediately to property, and we join in the application of this distinction to the case of our slaves. But we must deny the fact that slaves are considered merely as property, and in no respect whatever as persons. The true state of the case is that they partake of both these qualities, being considered by laws in some respects as persons and in other respects as property, and being compelled to labor not for himself but for a master, and being vettable by one master to another, and being subject at all times to be restrained in his liberty and chastised in his body by the will of another. The slave may appear to be degraded from the human rank, classed with those of an irrational animal, for which fall under the legal denomination of property, and being protected on the other hand in his life and his limbs against the violence of all others, even the master of his labor and his liberty, and being punishable himself all violence committed against others. The slave is no less evidently regarded by the law as a member of the society, not as part of the irrational creation, as a moral person, not a mere article of property. The federal constitution therefore decides with great propriety on the case of our slaves when it views them in the mixed character of persons and of property. This is in fact a true character. It is the character bestowed upon them by the laws under which they live and will not be denied. These are the proper creations because it is only under the pretext that laws have transferred the Negroes into subject of property that a place is disputed them in computation of numbers, and it is admitted that if the laws were to restore the rights which have been taken away, the Negroes could no longer be refused an equal share of representation with all other human inhabitants. Sound confusing? It should. Let me put this message in perspective. James Madison, the primary author of our Constitution and a slaveholder, wrote this passage during the Constitutional Convention of 1787. One of the most heated debates at the convention was what to do about slaves. A number of delegates from northern slave states saw that this is an opportunity to abolish slavery. Most of the southern delegates, most of whom were slave owners, intended to continue the practice. After much heated argument and debate, all but one state agreed to eliminate slavery. That one state, South Carolina, threatened to go its own way because it did not want to become part of the United States if slavery was over. The delegates, unwilling to lose South Carolina, acceded to its demands and so were stalemated. To resolve the logjam, the delegates decided to table the discussion of the abolish to a later date. Slavery would continue to be legal under the Constitution. This posed another problem. How were slaves to be figured in each state population count? Delegates considered this: the more people residing in a state, the more representatives that particular state can send to the House of Representatives, and hence the more power that state can wield. Northern delegates argued that since slave owners viewed those enslaved as property and grant them no rights, proposed that slaves not be continued at all toward a state's total population. Southern delegates attempted to argue that slaves should be counted as part of the population. The previous excerpt is an example of an attempt at resolving the problem. The main thrust of Madison's argument is that slaves should be considered property for tax purposes and individuals for the purpose of determining a state's population. He goes on to explain how it is the slaves are both persons and property. You can see the absurdity of his argument and the ludicrousness of the situation. Here you have slave owners having just defended their view of slaves or property in part as justification for committing some of the most heinous crimes against other beings, now trying to claim them as persons. And why? So they can have a greater power and soon to be formed federal government. Why did they need this power? To continue the institution of slavery as an economic juggernaut? It has become, and to prevent the Northerners from passing legislation for its dismantling. The agreed upon solution to this problem was the three-fifths compromise. Rather than each enslaved individual being counted as a person, three-fifths of a state's slave population would be counted toward the state's total population. In this, the enslaved became three-fifths of a human being. Cognitive dissonance, easing the conscience. By the time of Madison, it was generally accepted among many people in America that blacks were inferior. A significant portion of the population viewed Africans as a lesser species of human than those of European descent. Native Americans fell into the same subclass of human, Why did these views come to be so widely held? Why did the humanity of Africans as well as Native Americans become in question? When we commit a negative act or think about doing so, most of us get uncomfortable. This discomfort is caused by the difference between our action and what we believe about ourselves. For example, most of us would experience a certain amount of discomfort if we were to seriously consider robbing someone, and even greater discomfort if we were to actually do it. Why? Because most of us think of ourselves as decent people, and decent people do not rob others. This discomfort, called cognitive dissonance, cognitive, having to do with thinking, dissonance, meaning discord. The greater the difference between our actions and self precipitation, the greater the cognitive dissonance, and so our discomfort. Humans do not particularly like this discomfort. So whenever it occurs, we almost immediately try to resolve it. And we can resolve it one or two ways. One way is to own up to the negative act and address the harm caused by it. The other way is to justify the negative act rather than admit any wrongdoing. Quote, they deserved it. It is a typical justification in instances of particularly negative acts, such as wars of aggression, enslavement, and genocide. The perpetrators have to go so far as to dehumanize and, in many cases, demonize their victim. During the past 500 years, Europeans have spent significant resources to prove that Africans and those of African descent are inferior. The difference between the actions of the Europeans, quote, enslaving, raping, and killing, their beliefs about them, like we're good Christians, was so great, the cognitive dissonance so painful, that they're obligated to go to the lengths in order to survive their own horrific behavior. Excuse me. Chattel slavery and genocide of the Native American population were so unchristian that the only way they could make their actions acceptable is so resolve the dissonance was to regulate their victims to a subhuman level. Madison's statement serves to demonstrate demonstrate how far intelligent men will go in their efforts to rationalize their untenable positions. Europe's effort to justify slavery and the slave trade began in the 16th century, and America followed suit soon after. In a new history of social warfare, Phyllis Day observes, Virginia led the way in enslavement of people in African heritage when in 1660 it made them servants for life, forbade intermarriage with whites, and gave children born of African descended women the status of their mothers. Although there were some religious clause about making Christian slaves in 1667, it was decreed that conversion to Christianity would have no bearing on a slave status. Slavery, as practiced in North America, was a response to protests, Protestant religion, economic decadence. The wealth demonstrates morality, and to the even older of the fear of hatred of, quote, outsiders. Because Africans did not worship the Christian God, their lives were insignificant compared to the mandate of wealth for their masters. Slavery was not just the most part seen as evil at all, but almost a morality, since it protected, in quote, slaves from destitution, put them to work, and led them to wealth for God's chosen. These beliefs created a system of slavery unequaled in brutality and gave the rise to the American brand of racism. Excuse me. Being a Virginian, Madison came from a 140-year tradition of resolving cognitive dissonance by dehumanizing those of African descent. By the time the Constitutional Convention was complete, Madison and the other founding fathers had determined that Africans were e- e- equivalent to the three-fifths of a human. It didn't end there. Efforts to prove blacks inferior continue to this day. These efforts have been so successful that many white people believe their superiority to be true, and many others, while they don't believe it, act as they do. Even more telling, many African Americans act as if they believe it as well. The power of definition. Most of us have found ourselves deeply engrossed in a conversation with friends or peers where someone tries to no avail to convince the group that his or her view is correct and true. Two common strategies are employed in order to convince the inherent disbelievers. The first is to state that the point being presented can be sustained as true because it can be found in a book, and much confirms their position to be true. The second strategy is to state that which is being espoused has been significantly proven, scientifically proven. What we often believe to be fact is no more than a strongly held, substantiated belief. Hence, it is not all written in a book are touted to be science can be accepted as truth. How did we get here? To fully appreciate the depths of misconceptions, misunderstandings, and outright lies that underprinted the dehumanization of Africans and their descendants, we first need to be clear about some basic concepts and how they relate to each other. The definitions below are taken from Webster's Collegiate Dictionary. Opinion number one: a belief or judgment based on grounds of insignificant to produce complete certainty. Two, a personal view, attitude, or appraisal. Belief number one: something believed, opinion, conviction. Belief number two: confidence in the truth or existence of something not immediately sustainable to rigorous proof. Fact number one: something that actually exists. Number two: something known to exist or have happened. Fact number three: a truth known by actual experience or observation, something known to be true. Truth number one: the truth or actual state of a matter. Truth number three: a verified or indisputable fact, proposition, principle, or the like. Science number one: a branch of knowledge Our study dealing with a body are facts of truths about the physical or material world gained through observation and ex- experimentation. Theory, a purposed explanation whose status is still conjectural. So, an opinion is basically a thought that about the world, and its belief is an opinion about the world that we have convinced in and are hold with a strong conviction. We all have opinions and beliefs. We have opinions and beliefs about politics, entertainment, sports, and other people. It is important to note that neither opinions nor beliefs necessarily have a bias in fact or truth. Believing something to be true has no impact on its ver- verity. Believing in Santa Claus really, really hard will not increase the chances of a big guy in a red suit riding across the sky in a sled by reindeer and by Christmas, the night before Christmas. Be this as it may, beliefs are important. Some of our beliefs serve us well, others can be very disadvantaged. Facts of pieces, facts are pieces of information about something that actually happen and are actually exist. What we think about these facts are our opinions, our beliefs. Abraham Lincoln was the 16th president of the United States. Fact. Lincoln was a great president. Opinion or belief. The sun rises in the east. Fact. The sun is beautiful. Opinion. Compared to beliefs and opinions, facts are relatively rare. Believing things to be true does not make them so. For centuries, European scholars believed the earth was flat and the sun revolved around it. They were wrong on both counts. Whereas facts are pieces of information, truth is the whole story. Facts can be used to mislead as well as enlighten. The best liars use facts to perpetuate their deceptions. Quote, did you sleep with her? Asked the parent. Quote, no, I did not sleep with her, replies the son. The fact is, they did not sleep together. The truth is, they just had sex. You know the difference. Often, the truth is revealed only when you have all the facts. Science is an approach to gaining knowledge. Science uses known facts and truths to develop a greater understanding of ourselves and our world. Opinions and beliefs have little place in science. Most good science is advanced through observation and rigorous experimentation. At times, a scientist may have a intuit, intuitive insight into the world, the nature of the world. Then, using the science method, he or she would test that insight, sometimes leaving the testing to others. However, until the insight is tested, it remains a theory and cannot be assumed to be true. A theory simply is a proposed explanation about the world. More simply, a theory is a guess. A good theory is a thoughtful, considered, very well educated series of suppositions. Such a series of suppositions remains a theory until it has been fully tested and proven correct. We still call it Darwin's theory of evolution because there is still too much about evolution we do not know. Post-traumatic slave syndrome falls into this category. It is a theory meant to explain and why we move the way that we do in this world. So those are some concepts we must be clear about. As you will see, all manner of opinions, beliefs, half truths, and outright lies have been presented over the years to prove blacks are inferior to whites. Many of these were presented in the name of science. And many of these are printed in textbooks, scientific journals, media of the era, and the effort to prove white superiority goes on to this very day. And it is important for us to be able to differentiate the fact from fiction, science and fiction. Cognitive dissonance may be one of the answers to the question of why Europeans needed to view blacks as subhuman. Next, we must explore how Europeans convinced those of African descent themselves that they were lesser class of human. 18th century rationale. The answer begins with the preeminent Swedish biologist, scientist of the 18th century, Carl Linnaeus, 1707 to 1778. Some of you may remember him from your high school or college biology class. He laid the groundwork for the taxonomic system we use today to classify all plants and animals: kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genes, and species using his system. We were able to know every living thing's relation to all other living things thanks to Linus. We can know the place of each kind of plant and animal we find on Earth. Cows and oxen are bulbous, Douglas firs, n- gnats, cicadas, and redwoods are conifers. Panthers, tigers, jaguars, and leopards are felines. All bovinins and felines and mammals and so forth. Lane is also delighting the characteristics that made each life form fall into each group. His system was based totally on observations of an organism's physical characteristics. It was truly impressive and valuable achievement. The problem was he went too far. He expanded his system to try to account for the different types of humans. And unlike all his previous work, his classifications for humans usually considered fewer objective descriptors. With this highly suspect effort to classify humans, Linus began the science of anthropology and laid the foundation for the 19th century beliefs about race that resulted in racism. In his Systema Naturae, he set forth the race classification system using skin color as a create creator for classifying races, while also assigning moral and intellectual capacities to each race. These concepts became a permanent part of 19th century anthropological thought and language. According to Haller in his book Outcasts from Evolution, Linus describes Homo americanus as reddish, charcoaly, abstinent, contented, and regulated by custom. Homo Europeans as white, fickle, blue-eyed, gentle, and governed by laws. Homo Asians as sallow, grave, defiant, ruled by opinion, and Homo Afer as black, cunning, lazy, lustful, careless, and governed by caprice. Of our course, it is hard not to figure out whom he's describing. Now let's go back to our definitions. Linus was a permanent scientist. Did any of these descriptions have anything to do with science? Were any expertise designed to see if his observations were correct? Did he even have a intention to design experts to test them? Do any of them have any bias in fact or truth? The answer is a resounding no. While important work has been done in anthropology at the time, the field was full of unqualified amateurs and bigoted people promoting their wild theories, considering the true nature of man. Linus was among them, and moreover, his flawed theories gained attention and influence. Nell Arvin Painter, The History of White People, shed further light on Linus when she describes his pitiable and deficient education, which gave the science plenty of room to promote his spa- spacious assertions about race classifications. Lanus, after 1 week, received his PhD for a 13-page dissertation from the Dutch University of Hard Heidelberg, which one historian of science designated as a mail order institution. The university was known for selling degrees. In fact, in the Netherlands, when a person's scientific knowledge is questionable, it is common to say that he or she must be from the University of Harvard. So Lanus was just expressing his opinions. Maybe he actually believed them. Yet we know that the beliefs does not make a thing true. None of the observations, other than perhaps the humans have different skin pigmentations, have any bias in fact or truth. They really cannot even be considered so much as a theory. The trouble was that he wrote them in his book as they were facts and truths, and others believed them. Langdon's misguided opinions provided the backdrop for other researchers to develop their theories of racism and classism. The German scientist Johann Friedrich, 1752 to 1840, and his treatise on the natural variety of mankind, developed his own classification, grouping man into categories of, Caucasianism, Mongoloid, American, Ethiopian, and Malayan races. As Heller relate, rela- relates, while Linus founded his classificatory system principally upon skin color, Blumberg or Frederick considered a combination of color, hair, skull, and facial characteristics as a fundamental means for classifying the five varieties of man. Central to his study was the Caucasianum term, which he originated. He took from the name Mount Caucasus because its southern slope cradled what he felt to be the most beautiful race of men, the Georgian, the Caucasus near Mount Ararat, upon which the biblical ark came to rest after the flood, seemed to be the most appropriate source for the original race of man. Harler goes on to quote Frederick, quote, "For in the first place, the stock displays, as we have seen, the most beautiful form of the skull, from which, as a man and primeval type, the others diverge from by most easy gradu- graduations on both sides to the ultimate extremes. That is, on one side of the Mongolian and the other of the Ethiopian. Besides, it is white in color, which may fairly assume to be primitive color of mankind." Frederick, just like Linus before him, lacked adequate education and training, yet his work also gained prominence. He received his medical degree from the University of Göttingen after submitting his 15-page long dissertation, the result of 1 year's study with an older professor who owned an extraordinarily large and disordered natural history collection of skulls. He collected skulls. Along with the scientific races of Britain and the United States began to rank facial characteristics and skin color heretically, beginning not surprisingly with white as superior and most beautiful, thus identifying beauty as a scientific category. Hayner further explains that during in ancient times, the notion of race did not exist, and that not until the 18th century did an obsession with whiteness flourish. With the German invention of the notion of Caucasian beauty, they led the way to the construction of the concept of whiteness and white beauty. That galvanized beliefs in white supremacy and legitimacy of white domination. There, quote, white people in antiquity, people with light skin, certainly existed well before our own times. But did anyone think they were white? Or their character related to their color? No, for either the idea of race nor the idea of white people had been invented, and people's skin color did not carry useful meaning for determined races, especially in the 20th century. Racial identity and language had to coincide. Appearance would also figure in concepts of race beget beauty, and scientists succumb to desire with the concept of human beauty as a scientifically certified racial trait. We come to a crucial turning point in the history of white people. So, Bloombeck, or Frederick, was also just expressing his opinions. Perhaps he also actually believed what he wrote, but like Lanus, none of his observations had any base in fact, nor do they meet the standard for being considered a theory. The trouble was, he, like his predecessor, wrote them as they were facts and truths and those who needed to assuage their guilt took his and Lena's work as gospel, despite the fact that both Lanus and Frederick had failed to produce a shred of scientific evidence to support their opinions. Their ideas continued to be referenced in scientific communities through the Western world, giving the widespread dissemination of these fallacies, beliefs. It is not only difficult to understand why belief in racial superiority took root in 18th century and continues to exist today. Africans among many civilizations around the world who did not live up to European standards and so were considered inferior. They were inferior first because they weren't European, and inferior second because they weren't Christian. Thus, Africans were viewed as immure, irreligious, and uncivilized, fit to be slaves. In America, these efforts to prove whites superior to blacks continued to the grand European tradition of a documented in the portable Thomas Jefferson Notes on the State of Virginia by Peter M. Jefferson, considered one of the most learned men of his era, expressed disdain and contempt for blacks, stating that they smelled bad and they were physically unattractive, required less sleep, were dumb, cowardly, and incapable of feeling grief. In his attempt to justify slavery, he went on to write, "It is not against experience to suppose that the different species of the same genus of varieties of the same species may pose different qualifications will not a lover of natural history then, one who views the graduations in all of the races of animals with the eye of physiology and excuse an effort to keep those in the department of men as disdain as nature has formed them. This unfortunate difference of color and perhaps one of faculty is a powerful obstacle to the emancipation of these people." Finally concluding, advance it therefore as a suspicion only that blacks, rather organically a distant race, made disdain by time and circumstances, are inferior to the whites in the endowments of mind and body. Quote from M. Thomas Jefferson. These old quotes, man, from the 19th century. Contrary to his doubts, Jefferson's feelings on the matter were so strong that he suggested that blacks were to be removed by any possible contact with whites less than the race to be tainted. Among the Romans, anticipated required but one effort: the slave, when made free, might mix with, without sustaining the blood of the master. But with us, a second and necessary unknown to history. When freed, he is to be removed beyond the reach of mixture. Other founding fathers expressed similar views as to the status of blacks. James Madison, former farmer of our Constitution, viewed slaves as inhabitants, but as debased by servitude below the equal level of free inhabitants, which regards the slave as devised of 2/5 of the man. Further efforts to dehumanize those brought over here from Africa were written into law, the Virginia Code of 1705, which removed criminal consequences for killing an enslaved person, and the act, of correcting them. And if any slave resist his master or owner or other person by his or her order, correcting such slave and shall happen to be killed in such correction, it shall not be accounted a felony, but the master, owner, and every such other person so giving correction shall be free and adequate of all punishment and accusation for the same, as such accident never happened. The Virginia Code also referred to this as a casualty killing act, demonstrated that enslaved lack even the most basic protection under the law, the right of self-preservation. A similar bill enacted in Jackson, Mississippi, remained on the books until 1985, which, much to the embarrassment of the Mississippi legislature, it was discovered and voted out. And the efforts to prove superiority continue. Slavery produced or supported a white model which was justified by an ignoramus belief in colorism. The legal assumption that a colored person is a slave, life was viewed as part of being a chain that ascended from the lowest to the highest order. Such an analysts together with the Aristotelian notion of the natural slave, and finally the preservation of the so-called curse of Ham in Christianity, raised an answer to the crucial question. For Southern whites, at least by the 19th century, quote, which race of people were natural slaves, quote. The point of view further cemented white supremacy as the desired model and the culture of African Americans as the subhuman underclass in 1858. T.R.R. Cobb asserted. This inquiry into the physical, mental, and moral development of the Negro race seems to point them clearly as peculiarly fitted for a luxurious class. The physical frame is capable of great and long exertion. The mental capacity renders them incapable of success, self-development, and yet adapts them for the direction of a wiser race. Their moral character renders them happy, peaceful, contented, and cheerful in a status that would break the spirit and destroy the energies of the Caucasian or the Native American. Ota Benga. The little known story of Ota Benga, a 22-year-old Colonese man who was placed in the Bronx Zoo and billed as, quote, the missing link. In 1906 provides perhaps the most reprehensible examples of dehumanization in recent history. The Bronx Zoo continued to hold Ota Benga captive despite his consistent attempts to fight back in spite of public protests demanding he be released. Madison Grant was an attorney that lobbied to have Ota Benga placed on display alongside apes at the Bronx Zoo. Grant, a strong proponent of scientific racism, is best known for his work in conservation and eugenics. Ironically, while he dedicated most of his life to the preservation of wildlife, including the preservation of the redwood forest, different species of deer and antelope, and even sea life, He believed that certain races of humans needed to be reduced or eliminated altogether, namely Jews, Mexicans, and African Americans, along with the sick and disabled. His book, The Passing of the Great Race, touted to be the most famous book on scientific racism ever written, would win him the praise of Adolf Hitler, who stated, quote, "This book is my Bible." Grant believed strongly in forced sterilization was an instrumental in the enactment of strong immigration restrictions and anti mycin mycination laws. In the U.S., citing the dangers of inferior races outbreeding or mixed breeding with whites, in 1906, as Secretary of State, the New York Zoological Society, he wrote in defense of the depiction of Bonega as a lesser human, and an editorial in the New York Times that stated, quote, "We do not quite understand all the emotion with others are expressing in this matter. It is absurd to make moan over the imagined humiliation and degradation Bonega is suffering. The pigments are very low in the human scale, and the suggestion that Bega should be in a regular school instead of a cage ignores the high probability that school will be a place from which he could draw no advantage whatsoever. The idea that the men are all alike except as they have had or lacked opportunities for getting education out of books is now far out of date. Alta Bonega was eventually released on March 20th, 1916. He died from a self-inflicted gunshot to the head. Hmm. What is perhaps even more startling to learn is that there were human zoos throughout Europe, but somehow this information that is by no means unknown or obscure has never managed to reach our American textbooks. In the 1900s until the late 1958, people of color, often Africans and Native Americans, were placed in zoos and put on public display for visitors to observe. Hmm. Phrenology. By the mid 1800s, the effort to scientifically prove white superiority had support from another theoretic front. The science of phrenologies adheres to claim you could discover much about a person by examining his or her skull. Phrenologists believe the bumps on the skull coincided with the brain development, and so their careful examination, one could draw conclusions about an individual intellect and personality. As you might imagine, some of these scientists use this discipline to classify groups of people in order of intelligence. For instance, in 1859, phrenologists O.L. and L.N. Fowler wrote, "The various races also occurred with phrenological, phrenological science. Thus, Africans generally have full perspectives and a large tuner and language, but retiring casualty and accordingly are deficient in reasoning capacity, yet have excellent memories and lingual and musical powers. Indians possess extraordinary strength of the prominence and perceptives, yet have no great moral or infinitive power, and hence have very wide, round, co- conical, and rather low heads, but are large over their eyes. Finally, contrast the massive foreheads, all giant-minded men, Bacon's, Franklin's, and Milton's, etc., with the low, retiring foreheads of idiots. In short, every brutal head is constructed throughout strictly on principles ransack air, earth, water. Not one patable exception ever can be adduced. This wholesale view of this scientific possibility of mistake, phrenology is therefore a part and parcel of nature and a universal fact. Was phrenology science? Of course not. Unlike the works of Luenus and Beluchbach, at least phrenology achieved the status of theory. From the time of its first postulation around 1700 in Vienna through its time its final debunking in 1890, phrenology was proven inadequate again and again. Systematic research validating its predictions were never performed, yet phrenology was still accepted as scientific evidence as to the superiority of whites and inferiority of blacks by those for such rationalizations. Actually, a number of European anthropologists used it to claim uh, s- superiority over all other races on the planet. Not surprisingly, phrenology or originated in Europe and was in vogue throughout the United States. The fal- the fallacy of intelligence testing. The effort continued in the United States throughout the 20th century with intelligence or IQ testing. Yes, intelligence testing, or originated in our country. At various times in this country, and in this century, it was big business. In 1950s, 60s, and 70s, quote, "What's your IQ?" was a very popular question. Some industries use IQ to evaluate prospective employees. School systems use IQs to track students along academic and vocational paths. IQ was a very big deal. We were still testing people today. In fact, some researchers still use such testing as an effort to, quote, prove the superiority of one group over another. The amazing thing about all this testing is that IQ is a meaningless number. Scientifically speaking, in the mismeasure of man, Stephen Jay Gould reviews the history of intelligence testing and discuss its problems. His work is quite fascinating. I highly recommend reading it. It is important to understand that Gold's work because IQ testing is widely accepted as sciences, just as Luenus' work was accepted in such his day. And we must understand how little science was actually involved in this development. Intelligence testing is more or less the 20th century's version of chronology. It was all started with Alfred Bennett, an educator in France at the turn of the century. He noticed that the few of his students would fall behind, wondered if he could create a test that would help him identify these students so he could give them more attention sooner. In his writings, he specifically cautioned readers not to think of his test as having to do with intelligence. Intelligence being, he believed, inherently and immeasurably. In the 1900s, a group of American social scientists disregarded Beaton's work, began modifying his test, and eventually conceded tests that asserted more intelligence. The end result of the test was that the Stanford Bennett intelligence test now scales the granddaddy of all IQ tests. The test of all other IQ tests has been measured against for the decades. Among people to be tested were Polish, Russian, Italian, and other Southern and Eastern European immigrants just getting off boats at Ellis Island. You can imagine what it must have been like for these people. They have had spent days cramped onto a ship. They were tired, hungry, feeling the stress of arriving in a new country, hopefully, yet not certain of how they would survive. Most of course did not speak English. They got off the ship and were herded toward a building where they poked, prodded, and examined. In the midst of these medical exams, they were given a test in a foreign language to measure their intelligence. How do you think they did? Needless to say, they did rather poorly. After the results, the scientists concluded that Poland, Russia, and Italy, and all other countries sending us their least intelligent citizens, their dregs, did the Stanford Binet intelligence test actually measure intelligence? Almost certainly not. We cannot know for sure because the test was never validated. When we say the test is valid, we mean that the test, in fact, measures what the authors say is supposed to measure. In order to validate a test, one must compare the results of the test with actual objective outcomes in the real world. And herein lies the problem. Because there is no objective way to measure intelligence in the first place, it is impossible to ever validate such tests. So even though the Stanford Binet intelligence test was never proved to be valid, its prominence continued to assert that they had a test of intelligence. They made such good case that Americans started buying into the concept of measuring intelligence. Since then, many different intelligence tests have been designed. The test remains, though, that we cannot know what any of these tests actually measure. So far, no intelligence test has ever been proven to measure intelligence. More important, these tests have little to no predictive value. They cannot accurately predict whether a person will be successful. They cannot accurately predict how much effort a person will put into living their life. They cannot even accurately predict how well a person will do in school. Yet, for the better part of the last 100 years or so, there have been those who have used intelligence testing as a measure to validate their superiority. Attention has been placed on cultural bias of the test questions themselves, and there is certainly evidence of that. More to the point, however, these tests, culturally biased or not, do not measure anything substantial. Why we persist in using them is much more a testament to good marketing than good science. Land news taxonomy, Jeffersonian's reasoning, and IQ testing all served as, quote, scientific foundations upon the institutions of slavery, racial superiority, and inferiority were constructed. Since the time of the first enslaved Africans arrived in the Americas in the 1500s to present day, Europeans and their descendants have gone to great lengths to justify the 500 years of trauma and dehumanization they and their institutions produced. The effects on this trauma and dehumanization are observable today and can be explained by the theory of post-traumatic slave syndrome.